Lord Seventh
is a priest novel. This is an audiobook made by fans for other fans. Disclaimer. The main couple of the story is made up of two men. If you don't like it, don't listen. Thank you. Remember, subscribe and click the bell to stay updated on all the new releases. Enjoy. Chapter 2. It's better to come back. All Jing-Chi could sense was a burst of all-encompassing darkness. Everything looked to be distinct within the primal chaos, yet it also looked to be partitioned by a layer of muslin, unable to be discerned, enveloping him as if he could fall asleep with one moment of inattention. He recalled Bai Vuqiang's face from the final time he saw it, ice-cold and inflexible, like it was encased in a crust that didn't let one see it clearly, despite the finger placed between his brows having made him feel an ineffable heat. He had regularly heard of how Yellow Spring Road and the Underworld Gateway were both areas of extreme yin. When the elderly passed on, they would always have to make a padded blanket for themselves, and he knew that all the ghost messengers coming and going were akin to blocks of ice, as he could feel a chill when they came within 3 chi of him. He didn't understand what Bai Vuqiang had done, but when he thought like this, the final warmth the Soul Hook envoy had given him along with all those quiet words had faintly carried a tang of determination. Disoriented, he pondered, why should that be, really? His consciousness once again became hazy. He couldn't keep his eyes open, nor did he know how long had passed before he could feel his body and limbs. Considering he hadn't had the sensation of having a body for more than 60 years, he immediately came to, only to feel an unrelenting heaviness and a pain like needles were stuck in his brain. Every now and then, there would be someone walking around his side, the sound nearby one moment and far away the next, and then someone else pried open his mouth and poured a decoction into it. He didn't know which chump was doing it, but they were indelicately and recklessly cramming it all in there. His sense of taste was reinstated at once, the bitter flavor shooting to the top of his head. Due to 1 second of non-vigilance, he choked on the medicinal liquid pouring into his throat and started to cough, getting a burst of internal bedlam. That disturbance nevertheless yielded him some strength, and he barely managed to open his eyes. Vision blurry, he had to expend some effort in blinking a few times until it cleared up. He was currently being held in the embrace of a young man that was feeding him medicine, and when the other saw him choke and open his eyes, he swiftly set the medicine bowl to the side, patting him on the back as he called out. Request for the imperial physician to come over, now. The junior prince has awoken. Having just had a coughing fit and then gotten not too gently slapped by this youth, Jing-Chi angrily thought, did his nemesis send this little bastard over to give him a hard time, or what? Only, he saw the teen's nose scrunch up a bit, bowing his head to speak to him next. Master, the senior prince has already passed. If any sudden accident befalls you as well, who could we rely on? When Jing-Chi got a good look at his face, he was momentarily dumbstruck. This is Pingen. That was Pingen, bought and brought in by his father Prince at 6, who had followed him all his life from birth until death. Right now, the youth was no more than 13 or 14 years of age, merely a half-grown child. His eyes were fairly red around the rims with a swatch of black at their bases, their tears barely suppressed, and his clothes even looked to have done one major rotation around. Ping Jing-Chi opened his mouth, but his throat was rather dry and painful, so he was unable to form a complete sentence. He had been under the impression that he'd long since forgotten everything after several hundred years, but the instant he saw this young man, the faded color memories viciously surged up like a tidal wave. He finally remembered his own name, Jing Beiyuan. In the folklore of later generations, there would be the Jing Beiyuan who was Prince Nanning of the infinitely layered face, the Jing Beiyuan who once lived his entire life for one person, and the Jing Beiyuan whose funeral was indifferently attended by that person on the year he was 32. He had a sudden epiphany about the meaning of the Soul Hook Envoy's statement, returning you to a head full of black hair, and wasn't sure how he ought to react to the other doing so much for him. Pingen noticed his astonishment, believed that he was muddle-headed from illness, and got horribly frightened, shaking him back and forth. "Master, master, you mustn't scare others. What's happening? Why is the doctor still not here, the doctor?" Jing-Chi expended his strength to lift his hand up. This body seemed a few hundred times heavier than when he was serving as a wandering soul, and press it down on Ping An's own wildly shaking hand afterwards. Unable to form words, he simply half-lidded his eyes and gently shook his head. Receiving a smidgen of body language to act upon at long last, Ping An hastily got up, poured a cup of water, then cautiously attended upon him to drink it down. Only after that could Jing-Chi hoarsely get something out. "What time is it?" As soon as he spoke, he startled himself. His voice was raspy, but it wasn't difficult to hear the intonation of a young child whose voice had not yet changed, still bearing a bit of immaturity. He lowered his head to look at his own hands. Not only were they small and thin, but they held a slight blue-yellow tinge from qi and blood stagnation during sickness. "The time of the monkey, master. You fainted in the funeral hall and have since burned with fever for 2 days, not waking up no matter how you were called." Ping An pursed his lips, bowing his head to secretly wipe away tears that had flowed from the corner of his eye. The prince consort passed on early, and the senior prince was too callous, passing on like this. "You are presently the backbone of our entire household, and if something were to happen, this slave would simply pass on with you." So, this was the year he was 10, when his father Prince had just recently died. Jing-Chi's gaze fell upon his hands once more. Though his body was quite weak and cumbersome, it had a somewhat novel sensibility. After experiencing so many instances of reincarnation, to actually go back to his point of origin was really giving him 100 different crisscrossing feelings. Bringing Bai Vuchame to mind, that bit of novelty in his heart then diluted. The reversal of time and space, even though he didn't understand the ins and outs of that, did he not have some clear idea of the gargantuan price the Soul Hook Envoy had to have paid, for the sake of reimbursing him? For the sake of letting him experience that first lifetime of budding, doomed affinity once through again? Jing-Chi allowed Ping An to babble as he clumsily helped him lay on his back, inwardly sighing and thinking to himself about how it was little wonder that Sir Soul Hook Envoy was seen as being frigid and unwilling to talk much, since he turned out to be a bit of a dimwit. With another go-around, could the things that happened before then be as dust atop a table, wiped off with a single tattered rag? A human's heart was not made of stone, either. When rinsed off with clear water after being covered in grime, it would be as clean as it had been at the start. The imperial physician came in after a non-great period of time. He checked his pulse, gave him an inspection from head to tail, recited medical techniques from memory, in order to demonstrate that he was relatively reliable, and also said a heap of garbage like lucky folk of course receive heaven's support, his main concept being that there was nothing wrong with him and he'd be fine so long as he looked after himself. Jing-Chi had sat near the three-life rock for 60 to 70 years, so he naturally had the patience. Without anger or irritation, he permitted a group of people to manipulate him about, pour decoctions, and screw around like this was a routine affair, all the way until it was the latter half of the night. Ping An invited all the various slackers to get out, then helped him to lie back. "You just said that I've been unconscious for 2 days. Father Prince's Prime 7 is tomorrow then, right?" Jing-Chi asked mellowly. Pingen startled. Believing him to not be at ease, he thus said, "Rest assured, master. The prince's funeral matters were personally arranged by the emperor. He also came over yesterday night to see you himself, and instructed us to let you recuperate well, not having you be too troubled over other things." Jing nodded, then watched the canopy over his head blankly for a while. Right when Pingen was about to snuff out the lights, the other suddenly turned his head to him. "You may depart first." Ping An's hand paused in its act, and he looked at him somewhat questioningly. Jing painstakingly used his straw-like little arm to prop himself up from the bed. Leaning to one side, he used a practically greedy sort of gaze to take in the room, as well as Pingen. In his calculations, Pingen was on the cusp of being 14 at this juncture. He'd grown taller, but he still had a round baby face with a fleshy nose and fleshy eyes, giving him a simple and naive look. The child appeared to be innately not all there, his limbs grew, but he was always one step shy of coordinating them, never bearing an aura of intelligence all his life. Even so, Jing remembered how this fool child was actually one of the very few who treated him sincerely. Pingen always sounded a bit nasally whenever he spoke, and he was extremely fond of crying as a child as if he were wrapped in tears, his round little face eternally carrying an overtone of being wronged. Yet, it was this very year that he was forced to support the Prince Nanning estate in tandem with him, seeming like he had grown into a big little man in the span of a night. Following the senior prince's prime 7, Jing would be taken into the palace by the emperor to be raised up, and the old steward was up there in age, so almost all matters of the prince estate, big or small, internal or external, were for Pingen to take care of alone. Jing watched the young man, reflecting. In truth, Pingen had been devoted to the prince estate his whole life, and supporting this sparsely staffed home was quite difficult, yet Jing was the one who had ended up losing so stylishly. Pingen noticed his absent-minded staring. Believing that he was slow to regain his energy due to just barely recovering from a serious sickness, he softly said, "Master, one can't sleep well with the lights on. There's no need to fear the dark, as this slave will be just outside the room, and will come when called should there be something. Do I have an ability as grand as being able to call a dead pig to life?" Only after staring blankly for a moment did Pingen react to being made fun of, his face reddening. "Anyways, this servant will go take a breather," he stammered. Jing smiled without a sound as he observed him, his features smoothing out. His eyes curved first, after which his mouth slowly upturned. There appeared to be the glisten of water in his eyes, but upon taking a closer look, it was gone. Pingen thought that the way he was staring at him with a gentle smile actually slightly resembled that of the old steward, who had turned 50 that year. The gaze that landed on him had some preoccupation to it, as if the other was bringing very many things to mind in a single second, seeming somewhat exasperated, yet also somewhat gratified. What kid smiled like this? Pingen jumped in fright, believing him to have gone silly from fever, and reached forward to feel Jing forehead. "Master, do you feel any discomfort anywhere? Or, should I call the imperial doctor to come take a look again?" Jing shook his head, hanging his eyes and restraining his emotions, then allowed Pingen to help him lay. Pingen tucked him into the blanket, but before he could get up, he was seized by a pair of tiny hands. All he saw was their junior prince laying on the bed face up, both eyes gently closed. "Pingen," he said quietly, "it's okay. I'm here." His voice was delicate, very young, and soft. Using a child's voice to say that seemed like he was just being cutesy, but when he saw his expression, Pingen couldn't keep his nose from aching with tears. Jing smiled, then turned over. "Let's go to sleep a little earlier." The lights went out. A multitude of sounds all went silent. Perhaps because he'd been unconscious for too long, Jing-Chi laid on the bed unmoving, yet could not sleep. Using the spot of faint light that was coming in from the window, he stared at the bed curtain in a trance. Not even a moment later, that piglet snore of Pingen's was heard from outside the room, and he couldn't resist grinning. 7 lifetimes of reincarnation were enough for him to think through an awful lot of things, such as Helian Yi, and Pingen, and this impressive yet unfrequented Prince Nanning estate. Why had he been so engrossed with Helian Yi way back when? He'd been unable to understand this for many years, yet, when he had just barely opened his eyes here, he suddenly did. That senior prince named Lian Yu, courtesy Ming had been a fool, too. His own temperament directly followed that of the deceased old man's in that his eyes were hugely worthless. Upon needing to distinguish black and white, what he ought to have seen clearly, he did not, and what he should not have seen clearly, he was contrarily going to. He placed only one person in his regards his entire life, all others thus nothing more than thoughts, even in the face of a chilled heart. Every citizen claimed that the senior prince had been lovesick, as ever since the prince consort passed on, it was just like he had lost his soul. The emperor had empathized with his brother of a different surname, so he took heir Jing Beiyuan into the palace to be raised alongside his own sons. When he was 10, this old man that spent all day looking like he was disinclined to be alive had finally fulfilled his longed-for kickoff, casting off that 10-year-old child and his lonely, vacant prince estate to the human world. The earth was immense, yet there wasn't one place he called home. Aside from Helian Yi. 300 years ago, he had always felt that Helian Yi was the only thing he longed for in this world, and, like a piece of driftwood to a drowning person, absolutely had to be nabbed. Being like so in life, he would follow suit in death. That degree of persistence was on par with Jing Lianyu, and that level of idiocy was a different path with the same conclusion as Bai Vucheng's. Acknowledging only one person in this manner meant that, when it came to others, regardless if they were Pingen or a friend, he wouldn't pay attention to any of them. Jing-Chi listened to those peaceful, even snores, swiftly viewing himself to have truly been the land's #1 ingrate. Were those several lifetimes of hardships he suffered turning out to be retribution? Unaware of how long he'd been haphazardly mulling things over for, Jing-Chi then fell into a disoriented sleep once more. He was dozing one moment and waking up the next, sensing discomfort rising within himself again, like he was being roasted on the rack of a stove and every crack in his bones was oozing acid. He knew that the fever was recurring, and he knew how this would go, as well. Once he boiled through the night, he'd be pretty much near fine. Not wanting to call out to Pingen, he shrunk himself into the bed sheets, bearing with the heat and giving off sweat. A sound crisply resounded during his haze, like someone had bumped something and broke it. His chaotic consciousness was aroused with a start, but he was too lazy to open his eyes, as he knew that Pingen, the simple child, would not be at peace if a day passed where a few things weren't dropped and smashed on the ground. However, at that moment, a cold, overly comfortable hand was placed against his forehead, following which he heard someone's voice speak with a hint of anger. "He's burning up so much all over, is this how you serve him? Are you still not going to call for a royal doctor?" He promptly felt like, he ought to just let himself burn up into stove ash. End of the chapter. Stay tuned for more BL.